Hi, everybody. This lecture, we're going to continue on with personal identity in the self. And today, we're going to look at a couple other theories for identity, as well as some of the problems that go along with those theories. To recap with last lecture, the problem really begins with identity and what constitutes identity over time. We looked at the three main or three preliminary ideas or theories for identity. We looked at the soul criterion. There is this soul that everybody has that persists through time, this unchanging thing, so that even though our physical attributes change, our cells are depleted and regenerate, our soul remains the same over time. This, of course, was problematic, though, because we don't really know what the soul is, and even to suggest that the soul doesn't change is somewhat problematic, because we would want to say that our personality changes or our desires change. And so is that just the physical body, or is that part of the soul? Is that part of the necessary characteristics and qualities that I have? It doesn't seem like it's necessarily the case that the soul does not change, or that there even is a soul. And so this is problematic for a number of reasons. The physical criterion is also problematic. Think back to the thought experiment with the ship of Theseus. And the ship of Theseus has parts that are repaired, and an original ship is built out of all the repaired parts. And so over time, this ship is no longer comprised of any of its original parts. However, there is this ship that has been rebuilt from all the original parts. And so if this were the case, the ship that was built out of all the original parts would be the ship of Theseus, because the physical criterion suggests that all we are our physical attributes and our physical qualities. And when we start to lose those physical qualities, we start to lose our identity. And in this case, it might be so that if we lose 20% of ourself, perhaps we're the same person. If we lose 51% of ourselves, maybe now we've changed into a completely different person. There's no real definitive answer of how much of my physical attributes I need to lose before I become a different person, or how many pieces of the ship Theseus has to lose before it ceases to be the ship of Theseus. We would want to suggest that if a soldier came back from war with a missing leg or missing arms, that he or she would still be the same person and have the same identity. And the physical criterion doesn't really suggest that this is going to be the case. Lastly, we looked at the memory criterion, which is essentially that our memory is what constitutes identity over time. So as long as I can remember myself from the past, I am that person from the past. Now, the problem with the memory criterion, though, is that I may forget things about the past. So is that to suggest that I then am no longer the same person I was in the past? Or what about if I have a faulty memory of something that happened to me in the past? If I think I did something in the past, even though I didn't do it, am I that person because I believe I have a memory of doing it? It wouldn't seem like that's necessarily the case. Now, at the end of the last lecture, I mentioned a way in which we can somewhat salvage the physical and memory criteria. And that is through a continuity, through a physical or psychological continuity, where if the pieces of my physical body are changing, every time something changes, it's also changing and now a part of what is original. So if we look back to the ship of Theseus again, as it loses pieces from battle, or loses men from battle, places are replaced, and because there are parts of the ship that were there from the original voyage, those new pieces become part of the ship of Theseus. And then when more pieces are lost, they're added, but they become part of the original ship because they're combined now with the ship of Theseus. Same goes with the memory criterion, and we gave the example of the brave officer last time, where if I remember, or if I do something at the age of 10, and then at the age of 25, I remember doing that thing, then at the age of 40, I have forgotten that thing, but I remember what I did at 25. There is this continuity in my memory that keeps me being the same person throughout time. Now, as we'll see today, there are going to be problems with this idea of continuity. And it'll be the case that understanding our identity over time is not an easy problem to solve. And it's one in which, just like all the other topics we've looked at, seem to have controversial and contradictory positions and no real solution as of yet. And so each of these theories really aims at identifying what those essential qualities of a thing are. Remember, it's the essential qualities that we think make something up and are able to create that persistence through time. So for me to be the same person I was, there needs to be something the same now from when I was younger. If I'm able to lose certain qualities and still remain myself, then those qualities are just accidental. They're not part of my being. They're not part of my identity. Think back to the example of H2O and water. It is the case that H2O is an essential quality of water. Without H2O, you don't have water. Now compare that with the example of a dog and the dog's tail. It would still be the case that the dog is a dog, even if the dog were to lose its tail. And so the tail is not what makes the dog the dog. And so we can lose the tail and still have the dog. The tail is therefore an accidental quality of the dog. And so remember, what we're trying to look for is essential qualities. Something that remains the same that we can identify with throughout our timeline. Now, there are other theories, however, that would suggest that we don't need essential qualities to explain identity over time. The bundle theory suggests that identity is identity if a thing consists of its properties and nothing more. So what this means is that a person is comprised of all of the qualities that make up that person. A person is the sum of his or her parts. So here you don't have essential qualities. All the qualities of a person are accidental, but it's how those accidental qualities are combined that make up a person. And it's these individual qualities, right, that create an individual person, so that no person is completely like another person, because what a person is just all of these accidental qualities. And so no two people can be the same. This has an appeal to it in that it speaks to the subjectivity and individuality of a person. We're all different because we have different qualities. We have different personalities. We look different. We have individual fingerprints, chromosome patterns, different DNA. And yet, it still remains problematic that am I the same person that I was 10 minutes ago if a quality of mine has changed? So if I am the culmination of my accidental qualities, what happens when I lose one of those accidental qualities? Do I become a new or different person? Or am I still the same person, just with not that accidental quality anymore? So here we see that things are really comprised of just these secondary qualities. Think back to Locke and understanding a thing's primary and secondary qualities. The primary quality is a quality that's inherent in the object, while a secondary quality is not inherent in the object. The secondary quality is a quality that is perceived by someone else. So if we're to look at, let's say, the soul criterion, we would suggest that the soul is a primary quality of a person. The soul is that necessary quality. It's inherent in the person. It's unchanging. It can't be something that is perceived differently by different people. It's something that is unchanging. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, are based on our perception. And so if a person is made up of just secondary qualities being those accidental qualities, wouldn't it be the case that a person is not only different over time, but a person is different to other people? So for instance, I may look at a person and think that they have the qualities of a good sense of humor, that the person is beautiful or handsome, while someone else might look at the same person and think that they're not funny. They don't have a sense of humor. He or she is not beautiful or handsome. Wouldn't it then suggest that the person in question is two different people? Now, again, there's benefits and strengths to this idea, but also weaknesses. It would seem as though that makes a little bit of sense, because we would want to say that a person is different to different people. I think somebody's a good friend. Somebody else thinks that same person's not a good friend. Well, of course, we wouldn't want to necessarily say that that person is a good friend or not a good friend, and it has to be one or the other. Instead, they are a good friend to me. They are not a good friend to the other person. And therefore, there is two different types of personalities there. There is two separate identities. The identity of the person acting with me and the identity of the person acting with the other person. And so there's this draw to this idea that everybody is different to everybody else. But if this is the case, then how do we really identify somebody over time? If I'm a different person to everybody else, then why is my identity bound up with, let's say, a driver's license, where the person on my driver's license has the authorization to drive an automobile in the state of California? If I'm different to everybody else, Would I still be that person in 5 years who can drive an automobile in California? Why should that identity persist over time? What is staying the same? Again, if something changes about me, do I still have the same identity? Maybe my eyesight goes bad and I need to start wearing glasses. Right? Now, wearing glasses and poor eyesight is one of those qualities that I hadn't had before. And so what made me what I was before was a culmination of a bunch of qualities that included having good eyesight and didn't wear glasses. But now I have bad eyesight and I have to wear glasses. So my qualities have changed, but I'm still the same person. And so what would suggest that I ought to be treated the same as I was before? What makes me the same person then than I am now? And so while the bundle theory has these draws, there are problems that go back to the original theories that we looked at. In that, how can we explain the change of a person over time? And so, from the bundle theory, we move back to psychological continuity, something that was discussed last lecture. And this idea, somewhat like the memory criterion or the physical criterion, where there's some continuity over time that makes the thing the same thing over time. But unlike the physical continuity, psychological continuity focuses on all of the psychological or mental phenomenon that something has. And so it's a combination of the bundle theory and the memory physical criteria theory. In that, what makes something identical to itself over time is that there is a connectedness of mental phenomena that is continuous over a given time. And so I am the person that I was 10 years ago because I had certain desires, beliefs, hopes, mental features, fears, all that stuff. I had all of that stuff 10 years ago. And then as I progress through time, I start to maybe lose certain desires but gain others. I start to disbelieve some of the things I used to believe and now hold different beliefs. I have other fears or worries, but as those things change, they change in a way where there's always some original part combining with the new desire. So let's say I have the desire to finish school 10 years ago. I no longer have the desire to finish school now because I'm finished with school. So my desires have changed. But when I had the desire to finish school, I also had a belief that someday I was going to own a house. And so now my belief that I'm going to own a house combines with not desiring to finish school because I've already finished school, I have other desires. But now those other desires are combined with my belief that overlapped 10 years ago with buying a house. And so my continuity remains just like if I were to add a link onto a chain. Things change, things are added, I have new beliefs, I don't have certain desires, I have some hopes that are different than the hopes I used to have. And each time I gain one of those beliefs or hopes, imagine adding a chain to a link of chains. And anytime I lose a desire or stop believing in something, I would remove a chain from the chain. You always have the same chain, even though over time it's made up of different links of metal. There's always overlapping. And when there's always overlapping, that chain as a whole is my identity, even though parts change. The problem, however, and I mentioned that there were going to be problems last lecture. The problem with this idea of psychological continuity is that it could be the case that my identity now can create two me's in the future. Or it could be the case that two me's in the past were combined to create one me now. And this is the problem of fission. When we talk about fission, it is the case that our identity equivalents, me of the past, me in the future, could be with two past or future people. And it couldn't be the same that me now has the same identity of two people in the future. And so I'll present this thought experiment. Suggest that I have to get brain surgery, and my brain is cut right down the middle, a left and a right hemisphere. Now, what would happen if that left hemisphere and the right hemisphere were transplanted into two separate bodies? In that case, it would seem to suggest that me now, prior to the transplant, is equivalent to now two people in the future. So I, singular, would become two people. And it's not quite clear how two people can be one person, or how one person can be two people. I was reading a book a couple months back where this type of fission experiment was a common part of the culture that the characters in the book were living in. And what would happen was one of the children was created out of a bunch of other children's parts. And so what would happen was you have all of these children that are bad apples, are not good for society, whose parents don't want them. And so they would be sent off to be what they referred to as unwound. The book series is called Unwind. And so all of these teens that were problem teens would have their parts, their brain, their limbs, their reflexes, their hair color, their eyes transplanted into other people who needed them. So they were being forced to be organ donors. Now in the story, there's one character that instead of being a person who receives organ transplants, because maybe I don't have, my heart's not working, so I receive a heart transplant. There's one character that is created, a whole new person that's created out of many different teens. And so would we say that that one person that received the eyes of this person, the hair of this person, the heart of this person, the lungs of this person, the legs of this, right? Would that one person be equivalent to all of the other? And it's not quite clear how this is the case. And in fact, we end up running into logical contradiction when we try to express this position. For instance, take the example of me being split into two, my right hemisphere going to one person, my left hemisphere going in another. So now there are two individuals. One person only has the right hemisphere of my brain and no left hemisphere. The other person has the left hemisphere but not the right hemisphere. Now, again, these cases, in both instances, only having one hemisphere of your brain will create many important differences, right? One person might not be able to speak because speech is in one hemisphere and not the other. One person's going to have coordination because that's in one hemisphere and not the other. But there are going to be psychological continuity, or there's going to be psychological continuity with both of those people. So we would have to say, under the psychological continuity view, that both people are the one. But if both people were the same, it would be the case that in one instance, one person would think one thing and the other person would think something contradictory. So for in the instance of the right hemisphere brained person, it might be the case that at noon, he gets hungry. So the right hemisphere person is hungry at noon, while the left hemisphere person is not hungry at noon. This is where the problem occurs. Now you have two people that are supposed to be identical with me, and yet you have one person that's hungry and one person that's not hungry. But if they're identical with me, you would have to say that I am both hungry and not hungry at the same time. And that would create a logical contradiction. And so in this instance with fission, it would seem as though we would want to make the claim that no, we have two different people if my brain were to be split and given to two people. But under this psychological continuity view, they would not be two people, they would be me. They would be the same person because they share a psychological continuity with me, even though they only have one hemisphere of the brain. And so in this instance, we see that this continuity solution has problems of its own. Going back, you also have the problem with too many thinkers. This is another thought experiment problem that suggests that even when a brain is transplanted, even if a whole brain were to be transplanted, you would still have two instances of yourself. And it's through a thought experiment like this that we really start to understand where we come down on the matter of what makes our identity our identity. Is it the body? Is it the brain? What is it that makes us the same over time? And so if I were to propose this question, if I were to ask you, your brain is being transplanted into another body. And once your brain is transplanted into the body, into the different body, I'm going to kill one of the bodies. Which one would you suggest that I kill? Should I kill the body that no longer has the brain? Or should I kill the body that now has the brain, but is a different body from what you started with? I think we're inclined to say that we would want the original body that no longer has the brain to be killed. Because there's something about the brain, there's something about what the brain does that makes us who we are. But this is somewhat misleading, because when we think of identity over time, it's the case that some organisms exist that don't require brains. There are some organisms that exist regardless of level of consciousness. And so if I were to transplant your brain, essentially what I'm doing is transplanting an organ. And if I'm transplanting an organ, the body, the organism of the original body still exists, the same as it did before. Meanwhile, the new organism just has this extra organ in it. But do you go with the organ? If I were to transplant your heart to somebody else, would that somebody else now be you because they have your heart? Or would you just be this corpse without a heart? In this instance, we see that just because something gets moved from one place to another doesn't change the identity, right? The organism is this purely physical object. And the organism goes with a strict physical criterion, where the identity of the thing is this physical organism. And so some might suggest that even if your brain is transplanted, you still have yourself as this lifeless organism, or this organism with an inability to have consciousness. And so it's not quite clear that psychological continuity really gives us the answer that we want when it comes to the identity persisting over time. And again, we deal with these problems in terms of what are the necessary qualities that make me me. Derek Parfit is going to explain personal identity in terms of this psychological connection to ourself in the past. So again, think back to this chain link. When new psychological features are had, new chains are added. When certain psychological features cease to be had, they're lost. And Parfit is going to explain that it's this R relation, this psychological connectedness, what he refers to with this R relation, that allows us to persist over time. And the problem with this is that we see that a changing link of chain creates a new and different person in every stage. So if today I have 10 chains that make up myself, and then tomorrow I gain 2 more qualities, but then I lose 1 quality. So now I have 11 chains on my link. I am now a different person than I was, but I still remain the same chain. And so Parfit's going to want to say that we remain the same person as we are, as long as we have this psychological connectedness, as long as this chain of mental phenomena has this level of continuity. And Parfit is willing to admit that this chain is so different from what it was 20 years ago that I no longer am the person I was 20 years ago. And so I might be the same chain tomorrow as I am today, even though I gain or lose 1 or 2 links. But if we compare me and my 10 chains now to the 2 chains when I was a baby, it would look very, very different. And so me now is in fact different from me as a baby. Looking at the case of the brave officer, we might think that the brave officer is the same person as the person being promoted captain. But the retired captain is no longer the brave officer. And so here we see an example of A equals B and B equals C, but not A equals C. And so for Parfit, we do change from time to time. But it becomes unclear how many links does it take to change? When do we suggest that we are no longer the person we once were? What is it that's going to continually allow us to persist? And so another common thought experiment is that of teleportation. Let's say you step into a device and you're teleported to a new colony on Mars. And when you step into that device here, the device basically incinerates you, but the exact duplicate is created on Mars. Identical. Same psychological connectedness, same physical properties, same everything. We would probably want to suggest, we might suggest, that the person now on Mars is me. I have been teleported to Mars. But what happens if the machine here doesn't incinerate you? It just makes a copy. And then that copy is sent to Mars and rebuilt with the same psychological connectedness, the same physical stuff. So now there are 2 of you that are identical. Again, it's not quite clear how this idea of a psychological connectedness differentiates between the 2 people, me here now and me on Mars. Because both people will have the same psychological connectedness and the same psychological continuity. So it's important to really understand where this identity is coming from and what makes us the same over time. And how are we going to gauge what it is that's the necessary quality making us what we are? For Parfit, it seems as though identity doesn't matter, which is an interesting and bold claim to make. For Parfit, it's our survival that's important. And so identifying me with the same person from 50 years ago, I don't need to be that same person. In many of these instances, we would somewhat agree that I'm not the same person that I was 50 years ago. I'm very different. My qualities are different. My physicality and physical makeup is different. My maturity is different. I'm not that person. But that person has survived. And the image we can think back to is this link of chain, where the new links are added on. After a while, you'll see that the new chain link doesn't ever resemble what the chain link was, but they're pieces that continue on. There are things that move me from one point to the next. And it's through this connectedness that I survive in a different identity. Which is why Parfit is going to want to say that I'm identical to the person I was last year, but I'm not identical with the person I was when I was 15. And perhaps this is the case that I shouldn't be held accountable for promises that I made back then. This is why, even if you're sentenced to X amount of years in prison, you're able to get out early in certain cases. Because if the name of the game is if the idea is to rehabilitate someone who's done a wrong, then changing who they are, changing their outlook, changing their psychological connectedness would be good enough to warrant letting that person out of prison. Now, in some instances, we give people multiple life sentences and suggest that, well, it doesn't even matter if you're the person that you were. Their punishment is going to be a part of your entire survival. So again, you may not have anything the same or identical with the person that committed the crime. However, that person who committed the crime, there is this level of survival that continues. There is this transition that you have come from the earlier person. And that earlier person has done something so reprehensible that we're going to punish the entire line. And so we don't need to really have some identity. We don't really need to have some necessary quality to survive, to move forward. All we need is just a psychological connectedness so that our continuity over time suggests that we move forward. And perhaps this could be the case. And so this is why, right, every 10 years you have to get a new passport. After X amount of years, you have to start taking your driver's test again. Every certain amount of years, you have to recertify for work certifications. Because we want to make sure that the person who learned the information is continuing on with the same amount of knowledge or more knowledge and can do the job that needs to be done. And so for Parfit, all we need is this R relation. And that R relation is that psychological connectedness. But once again, you still wind up with the problem of my survival in certain transplant cases. If my mind is transplanted into somebody else, right? If the hemispheres of my brain were separated and both were put into different places, we wouldn't want to say that the two are me, right? So the one becomes two. Now the two individuals, one lefty, let's say, and one righty, those people are not identical with me, but it is a part of me that survives. And so this may cause problems when we start to think about people whose personalities might change over time in terms of relationships, or people who aren't what they were physically, and so not necessarily treated the same way prior. But it does have an appeal in terms of we lose this sense of identity. And so for Parfit, to correct the problem of necessary qualities, he just gets rid of them. There doesn't need to be necessary qualities. There are no necessary qualities. The world that we live in can be explained without identity, but instead in terms of survival. But this being the case, there are certain non-identity type problems that exist in the world, thoughts that we might have that challenge this idea of survival, perhaps. Take the slave child case. Say a child is born into the world, and the mother does not want the child, and so she gives the child up for adoption. The child is adopted by a family that turns her into a slave. Now, when we think to this child, we might think about the idea that this mother that has given away her child is responsible for this child's life as a slave. Because if this mother would have kept the child, the child wouldn't have become a slave and therefore could have lived a somewhat normal life. But in terms of psychological connectedness and continuity, there is no possible identity for the child prior to giving the child away. The mother is not at all responsible for the child becoming a slave because there's no identity beyond what the child is living at any given time. And so if the child became a slave, then all we know about the child's identity is that she survives as a slave in each place and time. And so we would think to ourselves that there's no possible way for this child to not be a slave because her survival has nothing to do with her identity. Her identity as a slave has nothing tied into her identity as a free child prior to the adoption process. And so if we were to see a case like this, it wouldn't be the mother who would have any responsibility for the child. We would suggest, or we would have to say, according to Parfit, that it's the parents that adopt and make the child the slave that are solely responsible. And so in each case like this, and what this case, along with other very similar cases like the depletion case and wrongful birth case, suggests, is that since there's no identity, there is no thinking of what if the child, or what if the situation had been different. All we know is that a given person has survived a period of time through psychological connectedness. But as long as that psychological connectedness has no bearing on prior identities, let's say, right? So if the slave child can't remember being free because she was a baby when she was adopted, a baby when she was free. So there's no psychological connectedness there. There would be no identity for her to think, at one point I was free. I'm the same person that was free and now I'm a slave. For the slave child, she has always been a slave. But I think in many instances we would want to put responsibility of the identity of this child on the mother who gave away the daughter or son. I think we would be inclined to say that there's at least some responsibility for the mother to make sure that she goes to a healthy and happy home. But according to Parfit's psychological connectedness, if we don't care about identity, without psychological connectedness, that slave child is not the free child. And so all she's ever known, or all he's ever known, is being a slave child, and therefore that is what she survives as, or he survives as. And this can be unsettling in certain instances. And I'd like for you to look up these other couple of cases and just think about what it is to exist or have an identity, and whether or not simple survival is good enough for explaining our instances of behavior and our instances of something like personal responsibility. Because as we'll see in the next set of lectures, free will and personal responsibility are going to be our main focus. If we're not free to make decisions for ourselves, should we be held responsible for those decisions? And if my identity is not tied to the identity of my past self, do I have responsibility for the actions of that past self? So please make sure that you're thinking carefully, doing the readings. And if you have any questions, as always, shoot me an email or mention it in the discussion post, or we can chat via Skype. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day, and I will talk to you next lecture.